Yeah. When it comes to, at least from my own story, when it comes to entrepreneurship, it's pretty easy to pivot. As
Mm,
you start building a community, as you start networking, as you start coaching and recognizing who you appreciate coaching, what you don't appreciate coaching, um, you're able to micro niche down as you're coaching to really hone in on what specifically you want to be working on. I feel like it's a little different with careers and with jobs because you spend a whole lot of time going to school, for instance, and then jumping into something, and then maybe a year or two in recognizing that you don't really even like that thing, and then having to pivot. What are your thoughts as far as pivoting um, in the same niche? I mean, into two different niches.
mm. Yeah, I think there definitely are easier like lanes to pivot in and out of, like through the lens of entrepreneurship, because you are more or less you're your own boss, you're making the decisions. And so if you wake up one day and you're like, I want to focus on this, there's of course always other people or things to answer to depending on your life circumstances, but you can make that decision and you can pivot. If you're in more of that traditional 9 to 5 corporate job and that type of thing, there can sometimes be more challenges with making that pivot. But I think the offset of that and like the pros and cons of each world, entrepreneurship versus like corporate or 9 to 5, is that you can maybe make that change a little bit slower, but with a lot more stability. Or you can make that pivot based on the specific like tasks and projects that you're saying yes to and all of that, or the way in which you're doing your work versus the actual task. So I'll give an example because I feel like that's a little like out there broad, but while I was working a full-time 9 to 5 job on a college campus, I was career coaching, more or less the same type of thing that I do now. But I found that in that role, I was doing things that were really kind of draining my energy, and just some of the responsibilities, tasks, expectations because of the environment that I was in were then causing me to like reach that burnout, not be interested in what I was doing and that type of thing. And so, one way that I started to make a pivot in there was by saying yes to projects that were more creative, that gave me a little bit more freedom, that allowed me to do different things, like starting to work on more of our social media presence and doing live interviews like this with alumni and that type of thing. And don't get me wrong, I was lucky that I was in a situation where I had a supervisor who just like said yes to a lot of the things that I suggested. But I think that that's a good example of where I started to make some of those shifts. And so then, even if I had stayed in that like 9 to 5 or in a more corporate setting, I could have then chosen that next job based on that. Like, what next position is going to provide me with those opportunities, versus then making the shift to entrepreneurship. So, I do think there's pros and cons to each. Um, I do think kind of as a foundational belief, like there are always ways to pivot and always ways to focus on different skill sets and to help them transfer between activities. And in the same way that you may pivot a business from that entrepreneurship side of things, like in most cases, you're not just saying like, okay, poof, like I'm shifting my whole thing over here, right? It's a little bit more of a strategic and a steady process to make that pivot as you're recognizing like what you like about coaching, what you don't like, and what you have capacity for, and those types of things. It can be very similar in that corporate setting where you're making decisions about what you say yes to and what you say no to, what additional projects you take on, or the way in which you're doing your work. And then also using that information to then make the next decision, either in how your role is going to change at that current company or in what companies, roles, and capacities you're going to move on